So I wanted to discuss the long talked about idea of splitting California into two separate states, specifically regarding the New California movement, which was recently launched in 2018. There's also another movement that was launched all the way back in the 40s that I'm going to be talking about. But the new movement in 2018 seeks to form a new California, and that's at least what the state they're saying would be called, is just New California, leaving behind the urban coastal areas like LA and San Francisco, and focusing more so on the rural and conservative regions. There is also the Cal 3 proposed for splitting California into three different states: Northern California, Southern California, and just regular California. This is mainly a movement similar in stature to the Greater Idaho movement, with rural and smaller conservative towns feeling underrepresented, considering the big state politics supremely controlled by the massive population centers of San Francisco, LA, San Diego, and other coastal cities. Now, the most obvious reason as to why this would never happen in the way it's distinctly different from the Greater Idaho movement, which I just did a video on about a week ago, is because it involves too high of a population and a very large changing of electoral votes from Democrat to likely Republican. It's estimated that New California would receive anywhere from 8 to 12 electoral votes, along with that, two Republican senators. That's a very large contrast. Not only does it take 8 to 12 electoral votes away from a solid blue state, but it puts them in the hands of conservatives, swinging the electoral math by upwards of 24 total electoral votes. Greater Idaho, on the other hand, might only add one electoral vote to the state, because most of the land that would be added to Idaho in the proposal is in eastern Oregon, which is very sparsely populated. The lower the population, the easier it tends to be in terms of enacting territorial changes. That's why liberals would argue that this is just an electoral college version of gerrymandering, because of the impact it would have on elections. There's also an older idea, and it's the idea of the state of Jefferson, which would encompass rural areas in Northern California and Southern Oregon. Advocates argue many of these same similar things that are discussed when talking about some of these rural areas joining other states. They just think they're underrepresented and are dominated by the big liberal urban areas. The movement dates back to the 1940s, so it's been around a while. The reason I think Greater Idaho has a much better chance of happening than New California or any of these other movements involving California is due to a few different factors, including having to deal with less population, which impacts the Electoral College and would give a distinct Republican advantage if it did happen, splitting up California. Just imagine that. All of the electoral votes, 54, I believe, is what they currently have right now. Those clearly go Democrat every 4 years, and there's no changing that anytime soon. You could, hypothetically, if this happened, gerrymander the state to make it to where you get some of those rural areas to either to form a new state or to join another state. But if this were to happen, it would have to be agreed upon by the state legislator, which is very unlikely to happen. And it's even unlikely to happen with the Oregon situation in Greater Idaho. But at least you're dealing with less of a population there, so you're not dealing with really much of an electoral college shift. That's more so Oregon losing resources to Idaho, but you could work around that because it's not a ton in terms of the population if there was enough of an uprising and people really demanded it. This is a totally different thing because you are dealing with a big electoral shift. Another reason why it's likely not happening is New California, the movement itself, would become the 51st state. Greater Idaho would just be a bigger Idaho. And with the new state comes a Republican governor, two Republican senators, and that's just another reason why the liberal state government of California would never allow this. Hypothetically, you could do a compromise. If New California became a thing, you could allow Puerto Rico to be granted statehood. I have seen some predictions and hypotheticals of Puerto Rico becoming a state, and I think they'd get around 14 or 15 electoral votes. Honestly, that might not be a good trade for Republicans if you're talking about Puerto Rico becoming a state, getting 14 or 15 electoral votes, and New California becoming a state, they potentially only get around 10 to 12 electoral votes, so probably not worth it, as it doesn't give the Republicans any type of electoral advantage. Although, to be clear, the idea of the movement is not to give them an advantage. It's because of the vastly different lifestyles, having their politics be virtually totally controlled by people that really don't care necessarily about what they want, the coastal elites, and that's where the densely populated areas are. That's, of course, what it would turn into. It wouldn't necessarily be the argument for representation. It would turn into, well, you're just giving Republicans more electoral votes. That would at least be my guess on that. Now, if I had to assume with a movement like this, for it to have any legs, it would probably have to follow the Greater Idaho movement. And the overarching reason these movements are even out there is because of the disproportionate relationship Republicans and Democrats have in terms of where they're located. Republicans control a lot of land in sparsely populated areas. Democrats are all together in big cities, but if the Greater Idaho movement happens, that could potentially give momentum for a movement like New California, although even something like that seems like a long shot to where you're adding a state, because then you would add the 2 senators, you would add the governor, very likely Republican, and it would hurt Democrats, and that's the state legislator that would have to sign off on that. So more likely, in terms of what I assume could happen that would be at least semi-realistic, it would be the parts of California that want to leave joining Idaho, along with potentially eastern Washington as well as eastern Oregon, to form probably just a Greater Idaho rather than add a 51st state. If you're going to add a 51st state, you're probably going to add another one just to keep it even. And I would imagine Democrats would really clamor if New California became a thing. They would push heavily for Puerto Rico to become a state, which, again, could end up hurting Republicans if New California were only 8 to 12 electoral votes. Puerto Rico potentially could be 14 to 15. There would be a lot of different dynamics at play in terms of that. But this kind of just relates to the whole idea of Greater Idaho, and I think it would be easier to swing joining Greater Idaho rather than trying to create your own state, because that would de-incentivize liberals within California even more in terms of allowing parts of California to leave, because you also have to understand they're giving up resources in those areas. Those resources would become, that decide to leave, they would become the resources of Idaho or of a new state if it becomes a new state. It would be a lot easier to do the state of Jefferson because of the small population. The estimation would be around 500K, which would be a very, very small state. So I guess hypothetically that could happen. New California, though, is different because it covers a lot more land and it would cover a lot higher of a population. An interesting fact about the idea of the state of Jefferson is that it almost did become an independent republic. They even had roadblocks set up for proclamations of independence in November of 1941. However, their plans were interrupted by the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. So it almost happened, but with Pearl Harbor happening, it interrupted their plans. You can also look at their flag with the 2 X's. Very unique. The 2 X's are meant to represent and symbolize their frustration with being overlooked for infrastructure investments along with economic development.